Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Some Stops Along the Way, your podcast that highlights some of the most interesting countries in the world through the lens of my work there, but also delves into the history, the geopolitics, and the culture of those countries. We're now fairly deep into a thematic area called Islam's fault line. We've talked about several countries in North Africa already, and we're getting ready to delve more into some of the countries in the Middle East where I've worked. But before that, I think we need to take a pause and talk about a seminal event that occurred in 2011 that changed the Arab world forever. It was called Arab Spring. And I really struggled with whether or not to do a podcast on Arab Spring because I know it'll be controversial to many because my take on Arab Spring may be different than that of a lot of people that I respect. But true to this podcast, I'm not going to go on a rant. I'm not going to throw out opinions that can't be substantiated. Rather, I'm going to try to look at both sides of the issue of Arab Spring and hopefully help you understand a little bit better why it occurred and what the result of this occurrence was. So let's jump into it here on this Monday morning. As I said, Arab Spring is one of the most consequential events in the 21st century in terms of the Arab world. It's a moment when ordinary people across the Middle East and North Africa rose up and demanded something different, something better, something they had been, for the most part, denied for generations. As I said, it was called Arab Spring. But that's a little bit of a misnomer because it wasn't a season and it wasn't a single movement. And it wasn't the same story in every country. Rather, Arab Spring was a rupture, a breaking open of decades of frustration, hope, fear, and possibility. It was a moment when the world held its breath, watching crowds fill the streets in places like Tunis and Cairo, Benghazi, Sana'a, Manama, and Damascus. A moment when the old world order trembled. So today we're going to explore where it came from, why it mattered, and how it reshaped the Middle East and North Africa in ways that the world is still grappling with. So settle in. This is a long road. We'll have many stops along the way, as it were, but we're going to really delve in to this phenomenon of Arab Spring this morning. And to really understand Arab Spring, you have to understand the world that existed before it. And that was a world defined by authoritarian regimes, by economic stagnation, by youth frustration, and by deep political repression. You see, for decades, many countries in the region were ruled by strongmen. We've already talked about Ben Ali in Tunisia, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, Assad in Syria, Saleh in Yemen, the monarchy in Bahrain. They were different systems and different histories, but similar patterns. And within this pattern was authoritarianism as a status quo. These governments controlled political life tightly. They controlled elections if they existed. But in most cases, elections were just symbolic. Opposition parties were banned or neutered. Security services were powerful and often feared. Another common denominator with these regimes was corruption and kleptocracy. In many countries, political elites enriched themselves while ordinary citizens struggled. Bribes were a daily reality. Jobs often depended on connections, not merit. I saw this firsthand throughout my work in the Middle East and North Africa, where corruption was such a scourge in society and it was so endemic to society that it didn't even sometimes register with people anymore. It was just the way they lived. They didn't know any other way. And that's what made this phenomenon of Arab Spring so unique. Another common denominator with these regimes was economic stagnation. I mean, it's amazing to me that many of these countries, and I'll use Libya for an example, had huge oil wealth, but still had massive unemployment, especially among youth. College graduates drove taxis, engineers sold fruit in the street. In a country where money was prolific, but the funds from oil and other precious minerals were only going to the political elite and their cronies, creating economic stagnation in countries that were otherwise cash rich. Another common denominator was demographic pressure. The region had one of the youngest populations in the world. Millions of young people were entering adulthood at the time of Arab Spring, with no jobs, no political voice, and no prospects for the future. Perhaps their parents and their grandparents had understood the system and had lived within the system and decided not to push back. But the youth were not going to stand idle. What they needed was a spark, and they got that. We'll talk about that later. And once they got the spark that lit the fuse, then the explosion that became Arab Spring became inevitable, especially as the youth flooded into the streets and squares of cities throughout North Africa and the Middle East. Another common denominator of these regimes prior to Arab Spring was the what I call the weight of humiliation. There was a shared feeling that was spoken quietly in cafes, whispered in taxis, and muttered in homes that the region had fallen behind. Their dignity had been lost. The world had moved forward while the Arab world had moved back, or at best remained stuck. As I said, all of this repression and economic stagnation and humiliation was like dry brush. All it needed was a spark to turn into an inferno. And that spark came on December 17th, 2010. I remember that day very well because, number one, it's my wedding anniversary. And so Debbie and I were out celebrating in Amman, Jordan. And I'd taken the day off. We were out enjoying an otherwise normal day in Amman when there started to be whispers. And then you could see people gathering in front of televisions in the mall. Something was happening. And I'll talk more about that later, in my experience later. But I remember the day very well when the spark that ignited this dry brush was lit. And it was lit by someone who no one would have expected. No one even knew who he was. It wasn't a politician. It wasn't someone in an opposition party. It wasn't the head of an NGO. It was a fruit seller. His name was Mohamed Bouazizi. And the way that Mohamed Bouazizi lit this fuse is that he set himself on fire. He was 26 years old, a street vendor. He wasn't a political activist. He wasn't trying to start a revolution. He was simply trying to survive by selling his fruit from a little cart in the street in a place in central Tunisia where I have been called Sidi Bouzid. As I said, Mohamed Bouazizi was not someone who was known. He was an ordinary citizen. He sold fruit to support his family. But in doing so, the local officials constantly harassed him. They demanded bribes. They humiliated him publicly. And finally, the seminal event, the tipping point for Bouazizi was when the local officials confiscated his cart, his livelihood. He couldn't then make money for his family. The little money that he was gathering selling fruit that was allowing his family a small subsistence while the ruler of the country, Ben Ali, and his family and friends were living in the lap of luxury. Bouazizi's small subsistence, his ability to earn a living, was taken away. And when that happened, something inside him broke. And he set himself on fire in protest. Now, one might say that's not the way to respond. There are other ways that this could have happened. Why kill yourself, especially in that horrific way? But those who say that likely don't understand the context of the world that Bouazizi lived in. When they confiscated his cart, that was the last event in a series of degradation that he had faced. And not just him, but many, many others as well, who were too afraid or too apathetic to take action. But on that day, everything converged to a point. And this young man, Mohamed Bouazizi, said, enough. I can't take this anymore. He didn't kill himself as an act of despair, as much as it was an act of anger and of resignation. But in doing so, it became something else. Within hours after Bouazizi burned himself alive, protests erupted in Sidi Bouzid. Within days, these protests had spread across Tunisia. And within weeks, they toppled a dictator. I remember that day as Debbie and I were out on our anniversary. And when news of Bouazizi's self-immolation broke, Jordanians began to gather and watch their televisions, and initially it was just reported as an act of a single individual who was frustrated with the government. But later that day, Debbie and I ran into my good friend and former colleague, Laith Al-Qasim. And we were discussing it, and Laith said, I'll never forget what he said. He said, you get the feeling that someone just lit a fuse. I'll never forget that statement, because Things like this had happened before. Maybe not in this exact way. But Laith was astute enough. He understood the region enough. He understood the frustrations enough to realize that everything was metaphorically dry brush. It was kindling, and that a small spark could ignite something bigger. And he saw this for what it was. When Bouazizi burned himself alive, he recognized it as that spark that could change everything. And within just a few hours later, as I said, it did, because protests erupted in this one town and then they began to spread. But no one was prepared. I don't even think Laith could comprehend the magnitude of what was about to happen. On January 14th, 2011, President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali fled the country. The strong man, the man who had given Tunisia stability, but who had also instituted corruption, been overseen huge repression that really led to the frustration that spilled over when Bouazizi lit himself on fire. On January 14th, Ben Ali was gone in the middle of the night. And for the first time in decades, an Arab dictator had fallen to a popular uprising. And almost immediately, then, the region took notice, and the dominoes began to fall. You see, the Arab world is connected. They're connected by language, culture, media, and shared experience. When Tunisia rose up, people across the region saw themselves in those crowds. They said, you know what? What's happening there is happening to us too. We're sick and tired of being sick and tired. We're tired of being oppressed. We're tired of being poor. We're tired of our voices not being heard. We're tired of living from day to day while the political figures and the cultural elite are living these wonderful lives that we can't even comprehend. So Tunisia, thanks to Bouazizi, was the first domino to fall. When Ben Ali left, that created a chain reaction. In Egypt, the heart of the Arab world, culturally, politically, historically, Egypt was the center of gravity for the Arab world. And protests began on January 25th, 2011. And when they began, only 11 days after Ben Ali was deposed, few believed that they would succeed. There had been protests before. People had gone out into the streets before. But Hosni Mubarak's intelligence apparatus and his secret police and the army were to be feared, and they had squelched every protest up until that point. I personally believe the tipping point for Egyptians is when they saw Ben Ali go, and they realized, wait a minute, Ben Ali was a strong man. He was as strong as Mubarak. And if they can push Ben Ali out, maybe we can do the same thing to Mubarak. And so they filled Tahrir Square with hundreds of thousands of people. Muslims and Christians guarded each other during prayer. Think about this. In a place where Muslims and Christians were constantly at odds with each other, the one thing that they can come together on is we want Hosni Mubarak gone. And literally, they were protecting each other against the police, the army, the intelligence apparatus. Families brought food. Doctors set up free clinics. Artists painted murals. The world watched. And on February 11th, 2011, after 30 years in power, Hosni Mubarak resigned. In 1 month, two of the strongest Arab dictators in North Africa had fallen. And then there came the next domino, Libya. We talked about it in a previous episode. The protests in Libya began in Benghazi. And as we talked about during our episode on Libya, Gaddafi responded with force. Remember, during the episode, I quoted Gaddafi's famous statement that we'll cleanse Libya house by house. He pushed the country into civil war. NATO intervened. But unlike all the protests before, unlike all of his repression before, the crowds didn't go away. They continued. The protests continued. And by October 2011, Muammar Gaddafi, the strongest of the strongmen in North Africa, and one of the most iconic figures in the Arab world and in Africa, was dead, as were many members of his family. In Yemen, mass protests forced President Ali Abdullah Saleh to step down after 33 years in power. In Syria, peaceful protests in the city of Dara were met with brutal repression by the Assad regime. What began as a call for reform spiraled into one of the most devastating civil wars of the century. And in Bahrain, protesters filled Pearl Roundabout, demanding political reform. The uprising was crushed with help from neighboring Gulf states. But Arab Spring affected other countries as well. In Morocco and Jordan, as I've already discussed in previous episodes, there were constitutional reforms to placate the masses. In Algeria, the government lifted a decades-long state of emergency. In Kuwait, Oman, and Lebanon, the government changed. And in Saudi Arabia, they increased subsidies and tightened control. You see, Arab Spring wasn't one story. It was many stories. When Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire, there's no way that he could have known that he lit the fuse that exploded in the Arab world. These stories in the different countries, they took their own shape based on local history, culture, and power. As I said, I lived in Jordan at the time and really had a front row seat. Debbie and I had a front row seat to see Arab Spring unfold. Let me tell you a little bit about it. Amman is a city that I've always loved. It's layered with history, full of warmth. It's perched on 7 hills like an old storyteller watching the world go by. Jordan's ruled by a king who, in my experience, enjoys genuine support from his people. a benevolent monarch in a region where that word benevolent is not always easy to apply. Debbie's experience in Jordan was much different than mine because while Jordan was a very middle of the road, if you will, Islamic country, it was not in any way um, oppressive, at least on the surface. But if you scratch that surface just a little bit, you would see that underlying that cloak of moderation, if you will, there were deep seated beliefs and deep seated conflicts within the population and within the Islamic and Christian communities. So while Arab Spring didn't unfold in Jordan the way it did in many of the other countries I've already mentioned, you could feel something shifting. I remember walking downtown near the Roman amphitheater while all of these protests were going on in countries surrounding Jordan. And I heard conversations in cafes and taxis and markets. The people weren't shouting, they weren't marching, but they were watching closely what was happening in Tunisia and other countries. And when Ben Ali left, they started watching Egypt. And then Mubarak was gone. And they started watching Libya. And Gaddafi was deposed. And this created a tension in the air, kind of a collective holding of breath in Jordan. Jordanians would say things like, "We are stable, inshallah, but the region is changing. We support our king, but we understand why others are rising up." These may sound like very benign statements, but they were not things you were used to hearing in Jordan. The Jordanians weren't fearful. They weren't even overly excited. They were simply aware. They were aware that the ground beneath the Arab world was shifting. And no one knew where the cracks were going to appear next. Even in a country with a respected monarch like King Abdullah and Queen Rania, people felt the tremors. And my team and I felt those tremors as we went about our work to help boost the economy of a country that's an ally of the United States. We had one of the largest American funded projects in the country that I led. And Arab Spring changed the way that we viewed our work and changed the way that we implemented our work. I think it took some time for all of us, the people of Jordan, and those of us who lived in that country that were expatriates, to realize that Mohamed Bouazizi's self-immolation wasn't just a Tunisian story. What happened next wasn't an Egyptian story. It was a regional awakening. And everyone from Rabat, Morocco to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia was watching. Fortunately, King Abdullah of Jordan is a very visionary monarch. And he moved swiftly to enact constitutional reforms that mitigated the kind of angst that occurred within these other countries. I also got to see several months later the next stages for Tunisia. after Ben Ali was deposed. As I said before, Ben Ali fled the country on January 14th, 2011, in the middle of the night. And this sent shockwaves across the Arab world. My first time in Tunisia after the revolution was in middle 2012, and the country was still vibrating from the aftershocks of what had taken place. At that time, I had the opportunity to visit the grounds of Ben Ali's palace, a place that had once symbolized almost untouchable power. And the story I was told by my friends there was almost cinematic. How Ben Ali and his family fled in the middle of the night, leaving behind clothing, furniture, jewelry, even a collection of luxury automobiles. The Tunisian government, by the way, later auctioned many of those items, which was a symbolic cleansing of the excesses that had defined Ben Ali's rule. But what struck me on that day as I stood on those palace grounds, which, by the way, none of the Tunisians that were with me had ever visited before because they weren't allowed to. What struck me wasn't the palace itself, it was the people. In those early months, and I made several trips to Tunisia between 2012 and 2019, many trips. I worked there a great deal. And in the early part of that tenure, my Tunisian friends were hopeful. They spoke about dignity, about possibility, about finally having a voice. There was a lightness in their tone that I hadn't heard before. The kind that comes when a weight's been lifted. But it didn't last long. Because on my later trips to the country, that lightness had dimmed. I'll give you an example. I remember one weekend in Sidi Bou Said, which you've heard me say before on my episodes on Tunisia, is a beautiful village near the capital city of Tunis. It's on the Mediterranean Sea, near the famous ruins of Carthage or Carthago. It's a village of blue and white buildings, cobblestone streets. It looks like Santorini, but with far fewer people. It's a beautiful place, and I would go there virtually every weekend when I was working in the country. I loved it there. Still do love it there. Sidi Bou Said's the kind of place where the sea breeze carries the scent of jasmine and grilled fish, where tourists fill cafes overlooking the ancient harbor. I used to sit at one of those cafes virtually every weekend on the hillside overlooking the harbor and spend hours working on my laptop, drinking coffee, having lunch. It was literally my favorite place in the town. And during the weekends, I would often walk around the village, and I was there so much that the vendors even started to recognize me. And there was one vendor who spoke English well. He had spent a lot of his time in Europe, so he spoke Arabic, French, and English, all three very well. And this would have been in the 2013, maybe early 2014 timeframe. I'm walking, as I usually did, through the area that was lined with tourist shops in Sidi Bou Said. And I started talking with this vendor that I had engaged with many times before. He was an older man, and his whole family worked in that shop. And he had been very upbeat after Arab Spring had happened. But by this time, late 2013, early 2014, his mood had changed. And I remember talking to him that day, and he said, "We made a big mistake." I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Mark, Ben Ali was a thief and a despot. But what we didn't understand is that he provided stability, and the tourists came. Even with his secret police and his and the army that everyone so feared, there weren't problems with extremists. It was a safe country. Tourists came from all over Europe, from the Middle East, from other places in North Africa, even from the United States." He said, "Now Ben Ali's gone, and we have instability, terrorist attacks, and no tourists." He said, "It's too late for us. We can't unring the bell." And this was not a singular conversation. I started hearing this from people in Tunisia that were in the know and that I respected very much. And none of them were angry. This shopkeeper wasn't angry. He was just exhausted. It was almost an expression of grief, because he realized that when Bouazizi burned himself alive and all these protests started and Ben Ali was dislodged, none of us realized what was going to happen. There was no plan B, because no one ever conceived that there could be a plan B. It was Ben Ali or nothing. Now Ben Ali is gone, what happens? Chaos happens. And where chaos happens, bad actors like Islamic extremists can take a foothold, because people are frustrated. They don't know what to do. And so once Ben Ali was gone, the stability that Tunisia had had before went away. I mean, one only has to look at the terrorist attacks that occurred after Ben Ali's ouster to understand the context of what the shopkeeper was saying. It started in 2013 with the Jebel Ekchambi attack. That's in the Kasserine region of Tunisia. They killed 2 soldiers and 2 others injured when their vehicle struck an IED near the Algerian border. But it even got worse. In 2015, that was the deadliest year. That's when the attack happened at the Bardo National Museum in Tunis on March the 18th. That killed 22 people and injured 50. Islamic extremists attacked the museum, they took hostages, and most of the victims were European tourists, which cut off the flow of tourists from Europe for months and months after that. Then, just a few months later, on June the 26th, there was an attack in Sousse at a beach resort where 38 people were killed and 38 injured, most of which were British nationals. Then on November 24th, there was a bombing of the Presidential Guard bus where 13 were killed and 16 were injured, and ISIS claimed responsibility. More attacks happened after that. In 2016, on November 5th, there was an attack in the Kasserine region where a Tunisian soldier was killed in his home by militants. In 2017, there was another attack in the Kasserine Mountains where 2 soldiers were injured by an IED blast. In 2018, there was another attack in Ain Sultan where 6 security soldiers were killed and 3 were injured in an ambush near the Algerian border. Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb terrorists claimed responsibility. There was another attack in 2019 on June the 28th, twin suicide bombings in Tunis that killed 2 and injured 8. In 2020, there was an attack on September the 6th in Sousse, where militants stabbed 2 officers, killing 1 before being shot by police. After a period of quiet in 2023, there was another attack at the Jerba synagogue, which killed 5 people, 2 civilians and 3 security officers, and injured 8. This is the kind of instability that occurred after Ben Ali. And this doesn't even speak to the economic instability and the political instability. But all of that converged into this toxic cocktail that let the Islamic extremists take hold. And it cut off a huge source of Tunisia's income, and that was tourism. And so the average person who is making a living as a shopkeeper selling souvenirs, or as a ticket taker at the Bardo Museum, which was closed for months after the attack, or a tour guide, their livelihoods evaporated due to this maelstrom of chaos that ensued after Ben Ali. Here's what a lot of people don't understand. And I'm not defending Ben Ali. I would never do that. Ben Ali was a despot. Period. But we also need to understand that almost no terrorist attacks occurred during his tenure as president, because he was a strong man and he created that stability, as Gaddafi did in Libya, as Mubarak had in Egypt, as Joseph Broz Tito had done in Yugoslavia. So this instability created fissures in society that continued to crack open. I've said many, many times in my career that investors can handle just about anything. They can handle bad news and deal with it. But one thing investors can't handle is instability. As long as they know the rules of the game, even if the rules of the game are bad, they can deal with that. They'll find a way to make money. But they can't deal with instability. And that's exactly where Tunisia found itself after the newness, if you will, after the euphoria of Arab Spring wore off. You know, the Bardo attack is especially poignant for me, as I visited the Bardo Museum shortly after it reopened. In fact, there were still bullet marks in the marble and on many of the ancient statues. I was an advisor to the country's chambers of commerce at the time and was heavily involved in recruiting foreign investment to the country. And the attacks such as the one at the Bardo received international attention and made it difficult, if not impossible, to recruit such investment. This instability was a vacuum that sucked up everything around it. When Arab Spring occurred, I told a colleague in Jordan that citizens were acting on emotion. As a matter of fact, I had an argument with many of my Muslim colleagues, not because I thought they were wrong or because I was trying to defend Ben Ali or Gaddafi or Mubarak. Absolutely not. The argument we had was that this emotion was going to lead to chaos. And if these countries didn't have a plan to put systems in place and to galvanize the people behind a system that could bring stability to the country, things were going to spin out of control very quickly. And that's what occurred. There's no doubt these rulers that I mentioned were despots. But to remove them with power, with no functioning opposition and no plan for succession, I felt like was reckless. And there have been many times in my life when I made predictions that have proved to be false, but this wasn't one of them. Regrettably, I wish I'd been wrong, but I wasn't. Take the Benghazi attack on September 11, 2012 as an example. While this attack happened after Arab Spring, the removal of Gaddafi in Libya created a power vacuum that allowed extremists to gain a foothold in the country. Chaos ensued, and Benghazi was the outcome of it. And the interesting thing about Gaddafi and about the world's response to Gaddafi and the overwhelming joy when he was finally removed, albeit through assassination. The strange thing about that is that by that time, Gaddafi had moderated his position. He started to move toward being more of a statesman than a despot. Now, certainly, he locked his country down tightly, and no one would ever say that at any period of time, outside of maybe the first year or so of his rule in Libya, that Gaddafi was a good person. But internationally, he had started to repair his reputation. It seemed odd to me that after all those years and all the egregious things that he had done to destroy Libya's reputation around the world, that at the time he was trying to repair it is the time that he was deposed. I could totally understand it from the Libyan standpoint because they were still having to live under his repression. But I couldn't understand this outpouring of joy by the international community, and America being one, when Mubarak fell and Ben Ali fell and Gaddafi fell. Because it was like no one, even those who knew better, and even those whose business it was to track global affairs, it seemed like that no one understood what was about to happen. We traded bad guys that created stability with worse guys that created instability. The Islamic extremists saw this as their entry point into these countries. And whether it was ISIS or Hezbollah or Hamas, whatever group you want to name, this was their entry point. If Ben Ali, Gaddafi, Mubarak had been there, likely doesn't happen. Now, again, that's not a justification for their repression. It's not a criticism of the reaction, the very understandable reaction of people who have been persecuted for their whole lives and who wanted to change. But what I'm saying is that when emotions take over, the law of unintended consequences kicks in. And that certainly happened with Arab Spring. And what this really reinforced in me was that revolutions don't end when the dictator leaves. That's where revolutions begin. And the hardest part, the part that no one chants about in the streets, is what comes after. And let's look at that. As I said before, Arab Spring wasn't spontaneous. It was a result of long-term structural pressures, such as the youth bulge. Millions of people in North Africa and the Middle East with no jobs, no political voice, and no hope. It was also sparked by social media. In fact, I would argue that's when the fuse was lit, that's what made it burn so quickly to the ultimate explosion. And that was social media. For the first time, people could see each other's struggles. People in Cairo could see the protest in Tunisia and how they were being dealt with. And they saw themselves in that situation. They identified with those protesters. And they used social media to spread this feeling of what they considered to be a revolution. Videos of the protests were spread instantly. Facebook groups organized demonstrations. Twitter amplified voices that had been silenced. Social media was the catalyst for Arab Spring. There was also corruption and inequality. People were tired of watching elites grow richer while they struggled to buy bread. They were, as I said before, they were sick and tired of being sick and tired. They were ready for a change. They were tired of the police brutality. In many countries, the police were symbols of repression. And Mohamed Bouazizi's story resonated because everyone had lived some version of it. Maybe it wasn't a fruit cart that was confiscated, but maybe it was the bribe they had to pay to get a driver's license. Or maybe it was having their home and their livestock confiscated because some strong man decided they wanted it. Maybe it's just the little bribes they had to pay during the day to the police to keep from being detained. Whatever it was, virtually everyone who wasn't in the political elite had dealt with it. And so it resonated with them. At the end of the day, Arab Spring became a crisis of dignity. People wanted dignity. They wanted to be treated as citizens, not subjects. They wanted to be treated as people with a voice. They wanted to have hope. They wanted to have a quality of life where their families were no longer on the verge of starvation. Arab Spring wasn't just political. People try to make it political. It wasn't about that at its heart. It was very personal. I've heard this from friends throughout North Africa, throughout the Middle East, and their views on Arab Spring. And virtually unanimously, they talk about it being very personal. Let's go back to this role of social media, because I think it's part and parcel to understanding Arab Spring. Because there had been protests before, some that had even proliferated before in these countries, but they never really went anywhere. So it would be wrong to say that social media caused Arab Spring. It didn't cause it. But it did accelerate it. Because protesters organized without central leadership. No longer did they need an opposition leader to come out and say, let's do this or let's overthrow the government. This was organic. There weren't any identifiable leaders, but they were organizing anyway. And videos of the brutality that these regimes were using to put down these protests went viral all over the world. International media was able to follow events in real time because people were using their cameras. People were posting on Facebook and Twitter. People were sending videos to news stations. We were watching the Arab world, as most people knew it, implode in real time. And that created this tsunami that eventually washed away the leadership, the entrenched leadership of many of these countries. The struggle was real and it became shared among countries throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Because for many young Arabs, social media became a place where they could speak freely for the first time in their lives. It was like a digital public square, and it changed everything. So, what came next? Well, you've heard my thoughts on that, but I have to say that for a moment, for a brief and shining moment, Arab Spring felt like a new era was beginning. I remember crowds chanting, "The people want the fall of the regime." Flags waved, songs filled the air, strangers embraced, walls that had stood for decades seemed to crumble overnight. It was likened to the fall of the Berlin Wall. There were so many people, whether it was in Jordan or Palestine or Saudi Arabia, that felt like this was the crumbling of the Arab Berlin Wall. This was their time to step into the spotlight, put the past behind them, and really succeed. There was a sense of possibility for the first time that the region could move toward democracy, accountability, and freedom. But what many did not understand is that revolutions are not clean, they're not linear. And they don't always lead to where people think that they're going to lead. There's a law of unintended consequences that kicks in. And that made the aftermath of Arab Spring complicated in one regard, but I would say most often it was tragic. Let me give you examples. In Egypt, after Mubarak fell, Egypt held elections, and the Muslim Brotherhood won. A year later, the military removed them from power, and Egypt returned to a more authoritarian system. In Libya, without strong institutions, the country fractured into rival governments and militias. Foreign powers intervened, and the country descended into chaos and into a prolonged conflict. In Yemen, the political transition collapsed. Civil war erupted, and a humanitarian crisis followed. In Syria, the uprising turned into a catastrophic civil war involving regional and global powers. Millions were displaced. This war actually started and was going on while I was in Jordan. And literally, you can drive from Amman, Jordan, to the capital of Syria, Damascus, within just a few hours. And yet it was like a different world, because while Jordan through Arab Spring remained fairly stable due to King Abdullah's vision and his wisdom, Syria spun out of control. In Bahrain, the uprising was crushed and the political space shrank even further. In Tunisia, as I said before, the transition devolved into chaos that allowed Islamic extremists a foothold in the country. Now, all this being said, I don't want you to think that I believe Arab Spring failed, because I don't believe that. But I also don't believe that it delivered what many had hoped, or that it made things less complicated in the region. In some cases, it made it more complicated because it revealed the depth of the region's challenges and the resilience of entrenched power. But we also need to understand that even where the revolutions didn't succeed, Arab Spring did transform the Middle East and North Africa. First and foremost, it shattered the myth of unshakable regimes. People learned that change was possible, but that change was going to come at a cost, and sometimes an extremely high cost. It also reshaped geopolitics. Regional powers, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, all recalibrated their strategies. Arab Spring also increased foreign intervention. Russia, the United States, Europe, regional actors became deeply involved in the conflicts and deeply involved in what came after those conflicts. There became this competition between Europe, the United States, Russia, China, to exert their influence in these countries during the power vacuum. Arab Spring also created new political identities. A new generation of activists emerged, connected, informed, and unafraid. Arab Spring changed the conversation in the Middle East and North Africa and around the world. Words like dignity, rights, and citizenship became part of public discourse for the first time. It also sparked waves of later protest in Sudan and Algeria, Iraq, Lebanon. They all saw major uprisings in the years that followed. So Arab Spring wasn't a singular event. It was the beginning of a ripple effect that would affect the North Africa, the Middle East, and the Arab world for years and years to come. So when we reflect on Arab Spring, what do we make of it now? Some say it failed. Some say it succeeded. I believe that picking either position misses the point. Because in some ways it did succeed, in some ways it did fail. But in reality, it didn't achieve what many around the world expected it to achieve. You see, revolutions are not judged in years, they're judged in generations. So really the effects of Arab Spring, we don't know yet. What we do know is that it exposed the fault lines of the region, the political, economic, social, and cultural fissures. It revealed the hunger for dignity and the cost for repression, and the cost of repression, rather. It showed the world that ordinary people could literally shake the foundations of power. And it reminded us that history is not a statistic. It's not static as well. It moves, it bends, it surprises. Arab Spring was a moment when millions of people stood up and said, "We matter." And even now, the fact that they stood up and said, "We matter," still matters. I look back at that time and I really believe that it was one of the most seminal times in my career because I was on the front lines watching this happen. I hope that you feel that my portrayal of Arab Spring has been reasonable and that we've looked at both sides. But more than anything, I hope you understand it better and what occurred. I want to thank you for joining me today on some stops along the way. And I very much hope that this episode will allow you to do some more research about Arab Spring and how it impacted not just the Arab world, but the world at large. I'll see you next time on Some Stops Along the Way.